It gives me great pleasure to welcome an esteemed guest. It's a great honor to have our brother, Dr. Ramzy Baroud, joining us in our inaugural episode. And it's a very timely episode and the podcast that we're doing because we're featuring the Nakba states. Welcome, Dr. Ramzy.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Khalid.
Dr. Ramzy is a Palestinian author. He's a historian and academic whose work focuses on Palestinian history, liberation, and people's history. He has written 6 books, including Searching Jenin, The Second Palestinian Intifada, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, The Last Earth, and These Chains Will Be Broken. His latest book, Our Vision for Liberation, which is co-edited with Ilan Pape, brings together voices shaping the Palestinian struggle today. Dr. Baroud holds a PhD in Palestine Studies from the University of Exeter and has taught mass communication at Curtin University. He is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. His academic contributions extend to numerous books and journals, and he has lectured at leading universities worldwide. His work has also been translated into multiple languages. So we are extremely honored to have at least about an hour, inshallah. There's a lot to cover, but we will go through as much as we can because Dr. Ramzy is direct descendant is a Gazan by birth, born and grew up in the Nusayrat refugee camp. And we'll touch on a few of those elements as we go through. Just very briefly, Dr. Ramzy, if you could just get us off started. What was it like? What's your earliest memories growing up in Gaza?
Well, if you do grow up in Gaza, like me, your world is very limited. There are 2 essential components that are always kind of juxtaposed in your life. Number 1, your desire to live a normal life under the harshest of circumstances. This is something very unique about Palestinian society, especially under Israeli occupation, but especially in the Gaza Strip. This constant quest for normalcy. So we would go to the beach until the Israeli army would come in and disrupt our fun, however long it lasts. We would try to live a normal social life and visit relatives until a checkpoint comes and disrupt our journey. It's just this constant juxtaposition between a people who just want to just really try to provide for their children, achieve a degree of dignity in their lives under military occupation and the like, and at the same time, and a whole foreign entity that is there that is dedicated to the disruption of any sense of normalcy. And that disruption can be anywhere from limiting, the curfew hours, limiting what times you go to the beach, what time you don't, what time you should come home, what time you should stay out, who is allowed to leave Gaza and who's allowed to come back, all the way to, killing Palestinians for various reasons, bombings and imprisonment, torture, and that sort of thing. Yet our ability to always shift back to that sense of normalcy is just absolutely incredible. I mean, the moment that the soldiers leave the neighborhood, for example, it's the very moment we just go back to being who we are. And this is something I think Israel has always failed to achieve, is to create a permanent disruption to the desire to live by the ordinary Palestinians. And we actually see this even now during the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So there is something, that's the real power of the Palestinian people, honestly. And I don't think this is really discussed enough, is our power is to prevail over the Israeli death machine and to hang on to our humanity regardless of the circumstances.
And I think that is a key element that Israel has been trying to eliminate over the years, unsuccessfully, because any other population anywhere else in the world if they had to withstand or experience what Gaza has gone through in the last year and a half, would have completely been decimated and wiped off the face of the earth. But yet, this is something that they just cannot get rid of. They cannot get rid of the spirit of the people of Palestine, which now the world is actually getting to see. And it's something that's become legendary. People have not been exposed to this. The Western world has not been exposed to this because the narrative has actually changed in mainstream media.
There is a. Go ahead, Khalid.
In this week, obviously, we commemorate and we remember the Nakba. It's 77 years that Palestine has been occupied. And there's always this conversation that keeps taking place, and you see it more and more in mainstream media and on talk shows. For a lot of people in the West, they woke up on the 7th of October, and a lot of people who know history and who understand the reality of the situation keep referring viewers and listeners and audiences to it didn't begin on the 7th of October, but we need to go back all the way back to 1948 and even before that in order to understand what's taken place in Palestine. What in your view was the kind of the political situation and the governance situation in Palestine? Because there were obviously events that led up to the Nakba in 1948. What was taking place on the ground and around the region?
Absolutely. Let's just look very quickly here at how Israel wants us to perceive history, how the Zionist narrative is constructed, and how the Palestinian narrative is constructed. Because if we try to understand these 2 points, we will be able to understand so much about the history that led to all of these events, starting with the Nakba all the way to the current genocide in Gaza and a different process of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Israel wants, or Israeli historians and academia, they wants us to believe that everything that has happened in history was an immediate reaction to something that the Palestinians or the Arabs or whomever have kind of imposed on Israel. So everything that Israel has done, for example, the Nakba, it was a reaction. It was a reaction to the claim that Arab armies came, thundering down every direction to destroy this tiny little state that was just established and to kill, to carry out another Holocaust, while the first one hasn't fully concluded. On the other hand, the Palestinians, like any astute student of history, wants us to understand that there is always context to every event. The genocide in Gaza did not happen in a vacuum, and it's okay to talk about what that context is, because if you don't understand the context, you will never truly appreciate the events that shape history. So we have to look at Palestine at the eve of the Nakba. When we talk about the Nakba, quite often we are referring to specific events that happened in 1948. The actual Nakba, or the catastrophe as is known within Palestinian lexicon, is an event that actually started late 1947, not 1948. And why is that important? Because in 1947, no Arab armies, no outside forces were involved in trying to reverse the ethnic cleansing that the Zionist militias, later the State of Israel, the Israeli army, um, was conducting in various parts of Palestine. In other words, the Arabs were reacting to something that was already taking place starting in 1947, as opposed to Israel reacting to something that the Arabs have supposedly done. But let's go a little bit further than that. The Palestine, starting in the 1920s, was under British mandate. What is the British mandate? The League of Nations, which preceded the United Nations, was essentially a club of powerful countries, mostly Western countries, that kind of shaped global politics. So they have decided that Palestine, uh, like other polities in the Middle East and other parts of the world, mostly in the global south, were to be placed under Western mandates, Britain, France, and others. These Western governments were supposed to help the people of these nations achieve a degree of independence because they don't have the political means or structures to fully move from an era of colonialism and slavery and exploitation into an era of civilization and independence and political sovereignty. So they needed to be helped. So naturally, who is the most rational actor that would help them achieve that is the very nations that actually colonized them and exploited them for hundreds of years. I mean, as idiotic as this may sound, that's what actually happened. But not just that. In the case of Palestine, the Palestinians are not actually guided by the British in order for them to achieve that coveted independence. The British were in Palestine helping the Zionists achieve their coveted independence at the expense of the Palestinian people. What was the legal structure for that British quest to help the Zionists achieve their independence in a land that doesn't belong to them? uh, was the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, we have to step back just a little bit, 1917. It was a British declaration that promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, laying the foundation for the political support for the Zionist project, completely disregarding the existing Palestinian population, who constituted about, and I'm thinking here from memory, for sure over 90% of the inhabitants, although I'm not certain about the exact number. The Balfour Declaration itself, and now we have to step back just a little bit to enlarge in the context. The Balfour Declaration itself was a response to the rise of the Zionist movement in Europe. The Zionist movement is not an indigenous Middle Eastern movement, it's a European movement. And itself was shaped around the European ideologies that yielded fascism, and Nazism later on, but was also kind of situated within an extremely colonial and exploitative European understanding of the global south and the rest of the world. So it's a colonial European movement that was espoused within a Western geopolitics, and started about, around the late 19th, early 20th century. And that's where the growth of the Zionist movement happened, with the idea that they want to build a Jewish state in Palestine. It's very important caveat here to remember, is that Palestine wasn't the top of the list of where that Jewish state was going to be established. And why is this relevant? It is relevant because the Zionists of today, the Israelis, argue that, this whole thing was really facilitated to allow the return of the Jewish people to their original homeland. If that was the case, why was certain parts of Africa considered to be that Jewish state, particularly an area within more or less part of it in today's Kenya? Why was Patagonia considered to be part of that Jewish state? So between Uganda, Kenya, and between Argentina, it makes no sense that if this was really supposed to be this part of a larger destiny of the return of the Jewish people to their original homeland, why would you think of other places aside from Palestine? The early Zionists were atheists. In fact, atheism has kind of defined Zionist leadership for many years. There is a switch that is happening in Israel today. It has started about 19 in the late 1970s with the rise of the right wing into political power, Menachem Begin, and other kind of components of what they call Zionist revisionism, all the way to today's Itamar Ben Gvir and Smotrich. But for decades, Zionists were atheists. So we now understand not only there's a colonial project, an exploitative project, a Western project, but it actually chose Palestine and it created the narrative around Palestine for purely political reasons. To the point that early Jews or many Jewish communities in Europe actually rejected Zionism, rejected Zionism, and this embrace of Zionism that happened to various Jewish communities around the world did not really take place until after the war of 1967, which we are going to talk about it here, where Israel suddenly tripled in size, and it seemed like a sustainable project. It seemed like the Zionists knew what they were doing, and that's where many of the Jewish communities that were in doubt about the power of Zionists and their ability to sustain their ideological project began kind of evaporating in favor of a new rediscovery of Zionism. The British mandate policies in Palestine therefore actively facilitated the Zionist immigration, land purchases, often through absentee landlords. If you want to, we can expand on what that means exactly, and completely suppressing Palestinian national aspirations and the resistance movements. It doesn't mean that Palestinians didn't resist. To the contrary, Palestinians were forming. I mean, just think about it. 1936, Palestinians launched a general strike that lasted for 6 months, in which all Palestinian societies, from the urban centers, the elites, the so-called effendis, all the way to the so-called fallahin, the peasants of Palestine, everybody participated in it. There was no social media, no Instagram, no TikTok, nothing of that sort. Yet somehow they found a way to communicate, to create this powerful, collective, at the time, as of yet, non-violent resistance to tell the British that we are a Palestinian people with a very defined sense of peoplehood, and we do have political agency, and we are unified, and we are capable of fighting back. So Palestinian political consciousness was formulated very, very early on in the process, which means another way of kind of defying the Zionist propaganda that Palestine had no sense of Palestinianism, that there was no such thing, that Palestinians were nomads and they did not belong to that land and they had no roots, no culture, no civilization. Explain these events that happened about 100 years ago, when most, today's nation states around the world did not actually formulate yet a sense of belonging to a particular geographic era. And many of today's countries, even in Europe itself, were actually did not exist in the current form in which they exist today.
I think that's a very important point that needs to be emphasized, because there's often the claim that there was never a Palestinian state. But if you go back, we find minted coins from the early days in Palestine. We find travel documents, we find maps, we find old Bibles with Palestine in there. In fact, some of the early Israeli leaders, Golda Meir, I think, carried a Palestinian passport, as did Shimon Peres. So this notion that's often regurgitated to the public by Israeli spokespeople is actually a complete lie. And people need to understand, the viewers need to understand, there was a very flourishing population in Palestine. And even though statehood as we know today didn't exist then, because this was just after around the First World War and then the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then Muslim lands in the Middle East started being carved up into nation states. I wonder if you could reflect on. You said there was a Jewish population already in Palestine, and then we have this influx of European Jews coming in, where the population swells between 1922 and 1935 from 9% to about 27%. How were these European Jews received by the Jewish Palestinians?
Right. So I think I would like to just make a quick comment regarding what you said accurately regarding the presentation of a state. What is a state anyway? Um, and this is where the Israelis, because you have to understand that the Zionists don't have a consistent narrative. The Zionists kind of poke holes in other people's narratives in order for them to legitimize themselves. You could explain to us why Israel has the right to exist as a state. Fine, we can argue against that. And by the way, Israel was admitted to the United Nations on the understanding that it respects various UN resolutions, including the right of return for Palestinian refugees and others, and Israel hasn't done so. So if we are going to be speaking very strictly here from a legal point of view, Israel has not satisfied the very conditions that made it a state recognized by the United Nations as such. But that's for another conversation. However, most of the modern nation states that exist today did not exist back then. Many countries that with current boundaries right now, they did not have these boundaries back then. So how do we recognize what was a state, let's say in the 1920s, and was what was not a state? What was a state in 1917 when Mr. Balfour made his statement promising the historic land of Palestine to someone else? The concept of state has changed itself. The modern nation state did not exist in its current form, and still, I mean, as in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, some nations became states registered or accepted as members of the United Nations. But what existed is a homeland. Was there a group of people seeing itself as Palestinians living in a place called Palestine, prior to the existence of Israel? Yes, that's the whole point of why the mandate system was created in the first place. The mandate system was not called British mandate over Israel because Israel did not exist. It was a British mandate over, you guessed it, Palestine. So even according to the League of Nations and the system of mandates, they recognize that there is a Palestinian homeland there for a group of people who see themselves as Palestinians, the same way there was a group of people seeing themselves as Egyptians and they needed a homeland and so forth and so on, or needed a state. And the same thing applies to Lebanon, Syria, and all these other countries in today's Middle East. The Palestinian relationship with Palestine, goes back thousands of years. Noor Masal has book Palestine, a 4,000-year history, is a must read, at least for the etymology of the word Palestine. Palestina prima, Palestina secundo, Philistia, which goes even prior to the Roman designation of this entity called Palestina prima, Palestina secunda, goes even prior to that. Some believe that the term Philista goes back to the Canaanites, and others would say the ancient Egyptians. Some say that because of the tribes that lived by the coastal region, that's my family, because we are coastal people, Gaza and all the way in the coastal Palestinian space. These are, they used to call them the sea people. We are talking about thousands of years of history. But skip that. Go to the Mamluk period. Go to the Islamic period, the 7th century and after that. You're going to find that Palestine has always had a very specific geographical boundaries under various Muslim empires. That kind of, so today's borders really more or less the River Jordan, the Mediterranean Sea, the Sinai, the Galilee, to be more or less the boundaries of these areas. This was honored all the way by the Ottomans until the British mandate. And this is why the Mamluks, for example, refer to Palestine as Jund Palestine, right? More or less the district of Palestine, the state of Palestine. The Ottomans had a similar designation, Sunjuk Palestine, and so forth and so on. So there was not only territorial entity, but it was administered according to constitutions, rules, and so forth and so on. How about the Palestinian sense of national identity? We'll go back to study the Ahmed Bashar al-Jazzar's rebellion and state in Aqsa and northern Palestine, and his resistance to the French attempt by Napoleon Bonaparte to actually invade Palestine. What made Ahmed Bashar al-Jazzar able to create an army that was centered in the city of Aqsa today? What was the sense that drove these people to defend what exactly if they did not have a defined and refined sense of national identity that's worth fighting and dying for? So this notion that there was no such thing as Palestine wasn't invented, repeated by these individuals, extremely racist, dehumanizing notion. More importantly, it has no understanding of history. at all. It uses this segmented view of biblical history that believes that there was a group of people who are the Hebrews that existed there at one point, as if the Hebrews are not Palestinians. And by the way, they are part of ancient Palestinian history. They are as much my ancestors as much as the Arabs are my ancestors as well. And then you have this jump of thousands of years ago when the Balfour Declaration took place. I mean, any serious historian cannot possibly and should not engage with this kind of nonsense and really try to understand the history of Palestine through independent prism. Forget about how Palestinians like to view Palestine or not. Just look at it from a professional academic viewpoint. You are going to find that there's a whole new reality of how Palestine actually became to be known as Palestine.
Before we move on, I just want to touch on briefly what was the reaction in the region, in and around Palestine, to the UN Partition Plan of 1947? How was this met by those surrounding Palestine, by governments in the region, or by populations in the region? How was this received?
So we need to know what is the UN, the partition plan. The partition plan, 1947, was Resolution 181. It proposed the division of Palestine, where about 56% of the land, the fertile part of the Palestinian land, the coastal area and the northern area, the fertile area, was allocated to the Jewish population of Palestine. And the remainder is to be allocated to the Palestinian Arab population, the native population. What was the land distribution at the time? Jewish ownership of Palestine at the time was less than 7% of the land. And that's after spending decades and infinite amounts of money to seize as much land and to purchase as much land as possible from the Palestinians. But they couldn't. The Palestinians were not selling their land. And that's another myth. The Palestinians were not selling land. Who sold some land were the kind of what they call the absentee landlords. A law was passed by the British that in large segments kind of acquired land illegally or prevented the owners of the land to return to their land, or most of the families that owned these lands were not actually based in Palestine itself. They were in today's Lebanon and Syria and Turkey. But even despite of all of these efforts, and of course, a lot of the land was seized illegally because of the taxes. I am a poor farmer, a peasant, and I have a small plot of land, and I cannot afford the taxes. So the British government would come and seize the land, and it becomes owned by the authority. And some of that land was transferred to the Zionists. Yet, despite all of this, they could only acquire about 6% or so from the land. The population, the Jewish population of the, okay, so we have the original Arab Jews. These are people who have been living there for a long time. They spoke Arabic, the accent of the region which they come from. They saw themselves as part of the social fabric of Palestinian society. And they saw themselves as the descendants of the original Hebrew, right? But then you have these colonialists, these Zionists, these Westerners coming from Eastern Europe, they're coming from other parts of the world, mostly from Europe, and coming there and as foreigners, as colonialists, with the same mindset and mentality and racist view that Western colonialists went to Africa and went to other parts of the world, right? Because of the support of the British migration, the British, or the support of the British of Jewish migration to Palestine, they managed to gather up around anywhere between fourth to the, become or constituted about anywhere between fourth to the third of the population of Palestine at the time. But the vast majority of them were foreigners, were colonialists, were settlers. And yet, despite of the obvious deficiencies in terms of number and land ownership and all of that, the UN partition came under US pressure and under British pressure, and others came and gave that minority in Palestine 56% of the best of lands, and the remainder went to the native Palestinians. So obviously the Palestinians rejected it, wouldn't you? Anyone would reject that. The Arabs rejected it. It is kind of putting some sort of a legal designation on the colonization of the vast majority of Palestine. That's what it was. It wasn't a solution. Another caveat that I think it's really important. Say that I come to South Africa as Ramzy. Ramzy is a billionaire. Okay, he's not a freelance writer. He's a billionaire, and he has a lot of money. And I started buying land in South Africa and registering the land under my name. And I have a certain amount of land in South Africa, and I started bringing my family, my friends, my neighbors, my social circle to live in South Africa. Do I have the right to declare a state in South Africa? What kind of a political system that would allow this to happen? So it's clearly the UN resolution 181 regarding the partition of Palestine itself is a continuation of the work of the Peel Commission in 1937 that also advised the division of Palestine. It's a continuation of the Balfour Declaration that saw the establishment of a Jewish state. It was part of the same Western conspiracy, Western colonial program that ultimately aimed at ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from their land, and they achieved in doing so, unfortunately and tragically, in by mid 1948, leading to what we know as the Nakba, or the Great Catastrophe.
So this was obviously you had Zionists working hard behind the scenes in Europe in order to get Britain on their side. You had Chaim Weizmann, who did a lot of work in Britain to get British politicians on side with their so-called vision. But then you also had some nefarious activities which were pre-planned, which were already taking place in Palestine, because people were being terrorized off their lands. Would you like to enlighten our viewers about what was taking place between the villages, which resulted eventually in massacres all over occupied Palestine as it stands today?
Absolutely. I will actually even humanize this subject a little bit more, because I spoke about it at length in my book. My father was a freedom fighter. Near my village, my family's village in historic Palestine, which still kind of was located in what we know as the Gaza district, in the northern Gaza district. So that's somewhere between today's Gaza and the Yafa district at the coast. There was a village called Beit Daras. About 2,000 people lived in that village. And that village, I mean, I tried to trace the history of that village, but you can imagine it's a peasant society. There was not lots of documents available about it, but I did manage to produce some documents from the Mamluk era that mentioned Beit Daras as a place that was used for kind of as a transition, or a stopover, if you will, between the Mamluks in Cairo all the way to northern Palestine, particularly all the way to Damascus. And later, Beit Daras was also used by the Ottomans, connecting Cairo all the way to the Asitana in Turkey. Near that village, sometimes, I think, if I remember correctly, it was 1884 or 1886. The Rothschild family bought a piece of land near my village, Beit Daras, and they gave it an Arabic name, Taiba. Taiba. Taiba became Tuvia in Hebrew. And Tuvia was essentially a colony, a small Jewish colony. And it started with some local Jewish locals from that area, but eventually it was populated by kind of Zionist settlers coming from Europe and settling there. The population of Tuvia or Taiba started growing. The people of Beit Daras that I spoke with, especially a generation that had a degree of political consciousness, they could not understand what went wrong. How did Tuvia turn from a neighbor of Beit Daras, in which the people would actually go and help the new settlers build their homes? They had no idea that there is a colonial project that is taking place here. My grandfather himself told me that he actually went and helped build houses, because they had no idea how to build houses, especially using hardened mud and that sort of thing. And to the extent they also knew nothing about. I mean, this is an agricultural settlement in which the settlers did not know how to farm the land. So the people of Beit Daras would go and help them to farm the lands because they are our cousins. We are driven to believe based on our religious beliefs and so forth. At one specific point, when the 1948 war and Nakba started, the gunfire directed at Beit Daras came from that same village, that Tuvia, that Taiba village. And that, and my grandfather died not understanding what has actually happened. He knew that there are Zionists and they were fighting them, and he was a fighter. He knew that there were British colonialists who are supporting these Zionists and the Haganah and the other terrorist groups, but he had no conception of why would my Jewish neighbor of old turn against me and start firing at my village. So the invasion of Beit Daras, leading to the massacre of Beit Daras in April 1948, in which about 200 people, mostly women and children, were killed, actually started in that village, in that Jewish colony, Zionist colony called Tovia. Now, just imagine this particular scenario and spread it all across the Palestinian countryside, all across other parts of Palestine, and you will understand what happened. That there was a Zionist movement administering, managing, negotiating the establishment of Israel over the land of Palestine, ensuring the flow of weapons, ensuring the flow of settlers and colonialists, facilitating all of that with the help of the British, but also other European powers as well. And on the other hand, in Palestine itself, there was a preparation for something major that was to take place. They worked together so very well to the point that it is believed that organizations like the Jewish Agency served kind of the role of the government prior to the establishment of Israel. In other words, the Haganah became the army, the Jewish Agency became the government, ministers were already designated. The entire thing was sorted out outside of Palestine, and as you said, in Palestine itself, in anticipation of that vital moment, which is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Again, we go back to the original point and to reflect about this silly notion. Well, the Nakba really happened because the Zionists or the Jewish community there had no other option but to fight back because the Arabs were invading. How do you explain the decades of history of preparations in anticipation of that moment? Ilan Pappy's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine is a brilliant start of understanding what was taking shape prior to the Nakba and the ethnic cleansing. And of course, if you want to learn more about what happened in southern Palestine in particular, in reference to what I just said, you can read my book, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter.
So the so-called newfound Israeli state was literally founded on terrorism, the very thing that they've been pushing back on, and they've been accusing the entire world of, and they've been accusing anybody who criticizes anything Israeli nowadays is terrorism, but that was what they were founded on. It's quite telling, which is why we have the phrase, which is quite common when you hear Israelis speaking nowadays, every accusation is in fact a confession. So
that's right, and this is, Khalid, this is not kind of an honest intellectual depiction of the events, considering the fact that Israel was established over the bloodbath of the Palestinians. In the numerous massacres from Deir Yassin to Tantura to Beit Daras and numerous others, the killing of thousands of Palestinians, the wounding of thousands of Palestinians, the torture of thousands of Palestinians, and eventually the ethnic cleansing of at least 750,000 Palestinians, which was the vast majority of the Palestinian population. In itself, from an honest intellectual depiction, this is a great act of terrorism. But actually, there's another dimension to it, that some of these Israeli groups and militias, they were actually recognized, like the Stern Gang, for example, the Irgun, they were recognized by the British themselves as terrorist organizations. And the pictures of the likes of Ishaq Shamir, Menachem Begin, and others, there were plasters on the walls of various cities in Palestine during the British Mandate because they were wanted by the British authorities that was there to help the Zionists establish a state. So imagine, even from the British point of view, knowing where allegiances actually lie and knowing exactly what was their purpose in Palestine, they still saw some of the Zionist militias to be so excessive in the way they are trying to establish that state, to the point that they designated them as terrorists. And this is recorded history even for the Israelis themselves. I mean, it cannot be denied, and it's not our own estimation of that history.
And then for the next almost 2 decades, they consolidated all the land grab. They consolidated, everything that was stolen from the people of Palestine to establish their understanding of a state. And then in 1967, they preempted an attack from the neighbors surrounding occupied Palestine, so from Egypt, from Syria, etc. What actually happened when all of this took place, and then resulted in what is commonly known as the 6 Day War, and then the obviously the capture of Masjid al-Aqsa, and even more land was taken from Palestinians.
Absolutely. But let me just sum up the 1948 to 1967 in just a couple of minutes, just to kind of help our listeners kind of try to understand what happened during that time. Very, very quickly, I promise. So, on one hand, you had a minority of the Palestinian population remaining inside Israel. These people were subjected to emergency laws. The emergency laws and the military rule was an extension of what they call the emergency laws and regulations that were used by the British against the Palestinian people, mostly starting in the 1930s in response to the Great Palestinian Strike and Rebellion, all the way until 1948. So they continued that kind of colonial treatment of Palestine's native population that remained in Israel. Regarding the West Bank and Gaza, they were constantly under Israeli attacks, under Israeli. At one point, Gaza was occupied itself in 1956 for several months by Israel. A lot of Palestinians were killed, so they were still not safe, even though they were pushed out of the boundaries of Israel at the time, right? And the Palestinians wanted to go back. Obviously, the refugees wanted to go back, and the United Nations said, absolutely, you have the right to go back. They passed a resolution 194 that allowed the refugees to go back to Palestine, because it's consistent with the humanitarian and international law. Israel wouldn't allow them to do so, and anyone who attempted to do so was killed. Yet at the same time, they created a law that basically said, since the Palestinians did not go back, we don't know what to do with their properties. So they established something that they called the absentee property law, that basically designated the properties and the wealth and the land of the Palestinians who were pushed violently by the Zionists out of their lands as a land that belongs to the state, owned by the state, and redistributed to the new colonial settlers. So you can imagine, in a situation like this, Palestinians are not satisfied. I mean, we are permanent refugees now, like my family. We are living in a refugee camp in Gaza. We have no access to our land. We have no rights that are being honored or respected. And so there is a strong feeling now, not only among Palestinians and Palestinian resistance groups, but around the Arab world, especially in Egypt and Syria, that there's something needs to happen. The international community has failed to allow Palestinians to achieve their rights as designated by the United Nations. So you are talking here at a period of increased Israeli hostilities, especially towards Syria. That's usually not discussed so much, but especially towards Syria's incursions and that sort of thing, and of course in the West Bank and other places. This led to Egyptian mobilization. The Egyptian mobilization in the Sinai Peninsula, in particular, And also it included Egypt telling the international forces that were, in the Sinai at that time to leave as a threat to Israel, that we are serious about going to war. You need to stop with your hostilities. Not just that. The Egypt declared the closure of the Straits of Tiran, or so-called Straits of Tiran, therefore blocking the Israeli shipping. Israel saw this as an act, a declaration of war, which is ridiculous considering that Israel on a daily basis was declaring war on the Palestinians and the Syrians and the Egyptians, violating the ceasefire agreement and that armistice agreement that was signed after the Nakba. But that particular move allowed Israel to argue, of course, with the help of the United States and their European allies, that indeed Israel is being pushed into this war. And when Israel said we are carrying out preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and others, the Western world kind of applauded that, because they kind of created this narrative that Israel was in a state of self-defense. But we know that this can't be the case, because if you are indeed in a state of self-defense, how do you explain the elaborate plans to take on this much land? We are talking about Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and we are talking about the Golan Heights, and we are talking about the Jordan Valley, we are talking about the Sinai Desert. Israel basically tripled in size in the matter of few days. If you were actually just responding to supposedly an act of aggression, how could you have possibly created this elaborate plan to take over this much land and to keep it? Another injustice in the way that the 1967 war is being told, because you have two separate narratives, obviously. The Israelis want to talk about the triumph of Zionism, as I said in the beginning of this conversation, that this is the time where the Zionists proved that the days of Jewish victimhood and victimization and weakness is over. This is the age of the powerful Zionist, the powerful Israeli. If you look at what happened in the United States, it's really fascinating how many Israeli soldiers started coming to American universities and even kindergartens and schools, talking about the powerful new Israeli that has managed to defeat all of these Arabs combined. The Arabs wanted to, they are now, deep into that state of weakness and self-blame and such. We rarely talk about the fact that this was not an Israeli war. This was an Israeli American war. The Americans were very much involved, maybe not in soldiers on the ground, but from satellites to military support. And there was no way that Israel was going to allow Israel to lose that war anyway, considering the amount of power and influence that the Zionists have played on the United States. That resulted in the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, in addition to all these Arab lands that I have spoken about earlier. And that kind of becomes the new challenge now. At one point, we just wanted to liberate Palestine, that was taken over in 1948, but now the entirety of historic Palestine, with millions of Palestinians, have been added to that mix. And that started a whole new challenge for the Palestinians and their Arab environs as well.
So this raises obviously two issues here. The Israelis then have a problem of the Palestinians that have become absorbed within 1948 Palestine, which they quite often boast about in the media today, saying we've got 2 million Palestinians who are equal citizens of Israel. They absolutely love the state and they're treated well and they have equal rights. This is one lie that they mentioned. And the other question I'll put forward to you, was this around the same period when Israeli-US relations were getting really strong? Because you talk about this was more of an American supplied military aid to Israel. So is this when it kind of started taking shape, the US military support for Israel?
Right. So now let's just talk briefly about the demographic problem, or the demographic bomb, as described by Israel. The idea that, okay, now we have taken this much land, that proves that we are invincible. I mean, that's when the term the invincible Israeli army started. It started in 1967, And it was completely shattered in October 7, 2023. And that's a huge problem for the Zionist project, obviously. But then we have all these Palestinians. What do we do with them? So there were attempts at ethnically cleansing Palestinians. About 300,000 that we know of were actually pushed out of the West Bank, mostly the West Bank, but also Gaza after 1967. It was not enough uh, to uh, to fix that supposed demographic problem for Israel. So they began building settlements, and they hoped that with building these illegal settlements, expanding the settlements, acquiring more Palestinian lands, you are naturally are going to push the people out. And if you push people out of the West Bank and Gaza, they are just not allowed to come back. So that was a way of dealing with their so-called demographic problem. But the numbers continued, even with all of this, even with the settlements and the expansion of the Jewish population and the occupied West Bank and all of that, it still failed. In Gaza in 2005, they were forced to take the settlers and distribute them somewhere else, although they continued the military occupation and siege of Gaza. In the West Bank, the settlements continued to grow, but the demographics did not really change so much. Yes, Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from many parts of the West Bank, and their population, especially in East Jerusalem, have dwindled from being the absolute majority to being a small minority. Yet still, the overall issue there remained for Israel, the so-called demographic bomb. And this is why we have seen, during the Gaza genocide, all of these attempts push them out, push them out. This is not about October 7. It has nothing to do with October 7. This is the old idea. They call it the transfer. And they feel like now, since we are already in, we have nothing to lose. We are in a state of war. Our reputation is in tatters. What will just an act of ethnic cleansing of 1 million or 2 million Palestinians would actually do to our reputation? It will allow us to buy some time in dealing with this demographic problems we have. Uh, to the second segment of the question, 1967 and the special bond, the special relationship between Israel and the United States. I would say that the relationship between the U.S. and the U.S. and Israel uh, uh, can be divided to three particular segments that are very, very important. Number one, when the British left Palestine on the eve of the establishment of Israel or the Israeli Declaration of Independence in historic Palestine, Israel was declared May 15th, 1948. The British had left in May 14th. Almost immediately, the Americans kind of moved in to try to become that new Western player. And so Israel, for them, was important in the sense they immediately accepted Israel as an independent state because they wanted to kind of create some space for them to maneuver as a colonial power with important interests in that region geographically, in terms of raw material, in terms of waterways, and that sort of thing. So at that time, Israel was important, but it was not the kind of the rally cry of American colonialism in the Middle East. 1967 highlighted Israel to the United States as the most important of all of its client regimes. And that's when the relationship began changing. But Israel was still more or less a client regime for the United States. But of course, not all client regimes are created equal. There is a spectrum, even for being a client regime. You can't compare, for example, Bahrain to Israel, and so on. This, but that relationship, that initial client regime relationship, went through the process of renegotiations thanks to the Israeli lobby in Washington. The Israeli lobby started, it was always there, always since the very start, but became quite strong and influential in the 60s, but all the way particularly to the 1980s, when for the first time, APAC and other lobby groups got involved in trying to dictate American foreign policy of to whom the US can sell weapons. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, AWACS, defense system, and so forth. They actually managed to dissuade the United States from selling military technology to Arabs. So that's a direct intervention in American foreign policy, and they succeeded. And that kind of changed American foreign policy or change the relationship between the US and Israel for the third time to what it is today, where you have this almost total suffocating control of the Israeli lobby, thus Israel, over the US Congress.
So then we obviously on the ground there's a level of unhappiness. People are displaced for a second time. This is the Naksa, and sentiments again. People are, it's our land that's been taken away. The resistance spirit is still there. It continues. It grows stronger. You have Palestinian resistance movements forming at the same time during that period. And then you have what Israel talks about as the Arab-Israeli War, which is in 1973, which actually lasts for quite a number of days. What led to the Arab-Israeli War in 73?
The let's remember the two terms Nakba and Naksa. They describe an emotional state of being. They don't describe political events. Usually battles or wars have some sort of a code name, if you will, that is usually designated by the state that is carrying out. The Israelis called the Nakba. That was Plan Dalet, Plan D, that led to the independence of Israel. The Arab defeats, though they had code names and battle names, none of this mattered to the people. It was the state of being, the state of the emotional state of being, Nakba, catastrophe. But 1967 was different. It was a letdown. Everybody was let down. We really thought that all this rhetoric about the Arabs coming to liberate Palestine is going to actualize and lead to something. But there was this massive collective letdown, disappointment, fatigue, emotional fatigue resulting from that war. So 1973 needed to happen because now you are in a state in which you have empowered Israel. Now is pushing new boundaries, playing, almost like an empire now in the Middle East, supported by the United States, supported by other Western polities, and the Arabs are weaker and weaker and weaker, and still kind of reeling from that collective letdown. And that's when the war started. It's really the emotional component of that war was very important. It was about restoring Arab dignity. The humiliating defeat of 67 had produced impact on the Arab world, as we said, and was seen as an attempt. The 73 was an attempt to restore that sense of Arab pride and to demonstrate that this is not the end of anything, but they are willing and capable of fighting for Palestine and for their own land as well. 1973 initially reasserted the Palestinian issue because at that time, we stopped talking about, my village in Beit Daras. We stopped talking about Haifa and Yafa and the 1948 Nakba, and we started talking about 1967 and the UN Resolution 242, and started arguing over, what land is included in that resolution that would call on Israel to leave part of the West Bank and Gaza, or all of it, and so forth and so on. We were not going anywhere. And the Palestinian issue was marginalized. Now we are talking about a refugee problem, about a group of people who just need food and water and medicine and nothing else. The Egypt and Syria were the main actors in that war, but they also received important support from Arab states and of course support from the Soviet Union at the time, while the West completely galvanized in support of Israel. What makes that war particularly important, I believe, is that there was kind of a shift in awareness and power. The shift in awareness is the fact that we realized that we are not really born victims here, that we are not just at the receiving end of what American Israeli imperialism is imposing on us, that we are actually political agents and we can make a difference. The second thing is that it allowed Arabs to use their economic prowess, particularly the oil embargo that was imposed by Arab producing countries and nations on the West. And it was felt. It was the first time it was actually felt among ordinary Americans, ordinary Westerners. And I think that was one of the main reasons of why the US became very much involved in the so-called peacekeeping or peacemaking rather after the war, because they realized that this is no longer a regional issue in which we have important interest, but it has no direct impact on us. No, it does have direct impact on our economy, and that's where the shuttle diplomacy after that war emerged, leading or culminating all the way to the so-called, the shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger, leading to the Camp David agreement, the treaty that started in 1978, eventually signed in 1979. And sadly, what started as a moment of triumph for the Arab, with American diplomacy, clever American diplomacy, ended up being an ultimate victory for Israel, because it sidelined Egypt from the question of Palestine using United Nations terminology, and left the Palestinians to their own devices. And that's another story.
It's actually quite interesting in terms of how Egypt was a key player. And obviously, the Egyptian population, segments within the population, were not happy with the treaty that was signed between Egypt and Israel, Egypt being the first country to normalize relations with Israel, which resulted in the assassination of Anwar Sadat. What was the sentiment and the feeling in Palestine from those peace accords in that so-called agreement in 78, during the 80s, when the world media, things were starting to filter out slightly, and I think the first time that the world started paying attention through the media, even though it was being kind of filtered out, was when the First Intifada broke out in 1987, because there were a lot of developments taking place on the ground. Would you care to talk us through the developments and then what led to the First Intifada?
Absolutely. So there is the Palestine Liberation Organization now. The Palestine Liberation Organization initially was a creation of Egypt under Jamal Abdel Nasser, and it was kind of largely controlled by Egyptian interests, and how they perceived what the interest of the Palestinian is and is not. After the Nakba, the PLO kind of was reshuffled around new priorities, where the Palestinians become the actual leaders and decision makers of the PLO, leading to the Rabat conference that designated the PLO as the only representative, the sole and only representative of the Palestinian people. That takes us all the way now to 1982. So Egypt is now sidelined itself from the struggle for Palestine. I remember the words of Anwar Sadat. I have to tell you something very interesting about Anwar Sadat, because I have very early memory of the perception of the refugees of Anwar Sadat. When he wanted to fight, when he fought the war of 1973, Palestinians, we used to refer to him as a prince. Oh, he's so handsome. He's just like a prince. Because we really thought he is the liberator. When he signed the Camp David Agreement, and I do have particular memory of that, my father basically broke the small TV that we had, and TV that was ran on a car battery. And it was like a wealth to have a TV, a tiny little black and white TV in Gaza at the time. He actually broke it with anger when he saw Sadat and Menachem Begin shaking hands, and that Arab prince somehow becomes extremely ugly, physically ugly person who is a donkey, right? So he goes from a prince to a donkey, and that kind of, in a way, kind of sums up the feelings that Palestinians had and the expectations they had in Sadat and Egypt, all the way to the Camp David. Well, now the PLO is in charge, and they have in South Lebanon they have a power base. That power base came under Israeli attack in 1982, leading to the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in 1982, and the American negotiated pushing of the Palestinian fighters out of Lebanon, in which they were scattered all over the world and had a place in, like, kind of their center in Tunisia. And with time, they became irrelevant because you have no power base to fight. And a great deal of corruption also started with the PLO, and elitism and all of that. Palestinians felt abandoned. First, they were abandoned by the Arabs. Then they were orphaned by Egypt. And then they felt like the PLO, the organization that's supposed to be their only and sole representative, is actually, I don't know, like purchasing hotels and running, farms in various parts of Africa. And they felt on their own. And that was the kind of the rise of the Palestinian intelligentsia in the West Bank and Gaza. We are talking about Palestinian nationalists coming mostly from academic institutions, from prisons, political prisoners, and the like. There is a new Palestinian that was formed this time with no Arab interventions, with no Arab influence, with no PLO leadership either. And that was, and they were as frustrated as ever, as angry as ever. All of their rights have been trampled upon. They have no support coming from anyone else, and they are now forgotten because the PLO is in exile. But there is a great deal of self-awareness. The Palestinian identity that was divided between the West Bank and Gaza before 1967 is now whole again. Palestinians are communicating with one another between the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, and now they are also communicating with the Palestinian intelligentsia and intellectuals in Israel itself, the so-called Israeli Arabs, Palestinian natives. And that's really the combination of all of these factors just needed a spark. And the spark was in December 1987, an Israeli truck driver intentionally drove over 4 Palestinian laborers and killed them. Now these events were always taking place, Palestinians being killed haphazardly. But that particular moment, I think, was that perfect spark because people were just at the brink and they needed that. And when that happened, the refugee camps of Gaza exploded. Started in Jabalia, then moving to Nusayrat and Baraj. Suddenly, all of Gaza is up in arms. When I say up in arms, it was an unarmed intifada, of course, kids throwing rocks. I took part in that intifada. The West Bank has joined in. Some areas inside Israel itself, Palestinian Arab communities joined in. And then you have one of the most incredible moments of self-liberation, if you will. I mean, this kind of reductionist approach that intifada was supposed to liberate Palestine. Intifadas of this nature don't liberate homelands, but they assert or reassert the power of the collective. We are political agents. We matter. We are our own leadership. Israel, of course, declared emergency rules. They began killing Palestinian children, throwing rocks in large numbers. Thousands were wounded as well. Tens of thousands of people were imprisoned, tortured. Israel began building prisons in deserts, makeshift prisons everywhere, Ansar 1, Ansar 2, Ansar 3, because of the number of Palestinian prisoners who kept kind of swelling up the prisons and needing yet more facilities to host them and so forth. That took us all the way to Oslo. Now, unfortunately, while the Palestinian people are capable of resisting and capable of pushing their narrative and their discourse and their political priorities, usually you kind of have the Americans coming in to try to facilitate something that would diffuse the situation once more in favor of Israel. So exactly what they did after 1973, that led to Camp David, they came as well after 1987, after the Intifada, and they came up with the Madrid talks leading to the Oslo talks and the Oslo Agreement of September 1993.
So the Intifada obviously had many. There were many results that happened as because of the Intifada. One of those was the West now realizing that we need to do something here because this is probably going to spiral out of control. There's media covering this. There's a large number of voices. There are media agencies that are now starting to portray what Palestinians are doing, and what you've touched on very importantly, the concept of new Palestinians who've been brought up, who've been raised and born in refugee camps, who've now realized that they have their own political agency, that they can manage themselves, and they're not going to accept the subjugation, which was something that obviously that led to Oslo. Were there any other reasons? Number one, for Oslo, and what was What do you think were the primary motivations for the United States to be the broker, to involve itself as a broker during the Oslo Accords?
Well, let's just start with the positive element here, because the Intifada did demonstrate the resilience and determination of the Palestinian people. It highlighted the unsustainability, if you will, of the Israeli military occupation, creating a sense of urgency for a political solution. Because it seems like, really, with any national struggle for liberation, unless there is an element of disturbance of the people just saying, we are over here and we do not accept the status quo, and we are willing to create a disruption of some kind, you're not going to take them serious. So the Intifada kind of forced everyone to take the Palestinians finally serious. Now, we talk about this current genocide in Gaza to be the kind of the world's first streamed, or live streamed genocide, but we forget about the visual elements of the First Intifada, because it was very, very important too. Because you have people now with cameras, if not video footage, you have still photos, people taking photos, documenting what is happening. You have Israeli soldiers in tanks, full gear, opening fire at children who are barefoot. The propaganda, the Zionist propaganda, began faltering. I really do think that the beginning of the end, or the collapse of the Zionist propaganda, started during the First Intifada. And so that had an impact. Something needed to happen politically. What was happening around the world during that time? There was a regional dynamics that was at work. Because you are talking about the end of the Cold War, the end of the First Gulf War. The US is imposing itself now as the new regional hegemon. No Soviets to challenge them. They have proved through their action in Iraq that they are capable of creating new reality through war. And now they want to also prove to be the peacemakers. The Americans are good at this idea that we want to win in both war and peace. War, well, you see what happened in Iraq repeatedly, but peace by giving the illusion that we are the leaders of new diplomatic initiatives. Never really true peace, never just peace, never equal peace. It's always a pretend that we are doing some sort of a diplomatic initiative so that we find the balance between that war and peace. On the other hand, on the Palestinian side, the PLO is becoming not only weak, because they were becoming weak and marginalized before, but they are becoming weak and marginalized among the Palestinians themselves. We have new leaders now. We are looking at people like Haidar Abdel Shafi and Hanan Ashrawi and these guys as the new representatives of the Palestine. Not those with still talking about revolutions from Tunisian hotels. So there is a dichotomy here. The PLO needed something. Arafat in particular, Fatah in particular, needed something to reassert themselves as fundamental to the political agenda of the Palestinian people. So they engaged for their own reasons, while the Americans engaged for their own reasons, and Israel engaged because Israel wanted a way out of the Intifada. So they negotiated with the PLO, despite the fact that they recognize the PLO as a terrorist, this and that, and Yasser Arafat is the world's greatest terrorist, but they had no alternative. It's either that and see what kind of compromises you have to make to that power, the Tunis-based power politic, basically Yasser Arafat and his men, or you have to deal with a continuous rebellion in Palestine by ordinary people, and you have to make major compromises that could ultimately lead to some kind of sovereignty for Palestinians within the occupied territories.
Yasser Arafat was under a lot of criticism, both from within Palestine and from outside of Palestine, within the Arab world, within the Muslim world, for actually stepping on the lawn and shaking hands with Israel and signing the accords, because he in effect legalized and recognized Israel as a state, as a legal entity. And many felt that there was a mass betrayal of Palestine, of the Palestinian cause, of the Palestinian people. How was he viewed? How was Oslo viewed by people outside of Palestine, within the region, within the Arab and Muslim communities, as well as the growing resistance movements within Palestine. How was Oslo and Yasser Arafat viewed after that?
So initially, of course, various resistance movements, um, rejected Oslo specifically because of the point of recognition, this mutual recognition. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that. The PLO recognized Israel on behalf of the Palestinian people. Israel did not recognize Palestine or the Palestinian people. It merely recognized the PLO. And as we said, the PLO was already marginal outsider party. So that really did not was not a big deal as far as, it was not an equal mutual recognition. I'm recognizing you as a state, you recognize me as a political group. Uh, that led to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Initially, many Palestinians within Palestine itself, because I was in Palestine at the time, and we have to be true to history, uh, um, many Palestinians did support Oslo because they believed in Yasser Arafat. I mean, he was an icon. The old man, we called him Likhtiyar. He knows what he's doing. Nobody loves Palestine more than Yasser Arafat. And as a result, whatever Yasser Arafat did for many Palestinians had to be the right thing, because Arafat loves Palestine and he knows what he's doing. For other Palestinians, they kind of played this let's wait and see sort of thing. And these were the skeptics. The third group were those who rejected Oslo altogether. And that's the Islamists and some within the socialist camp as well. Eventually, everybody kind of, aside from Hamas, kind of played along for a period of time to see what would happen. But quickly, it was clear that there is something completely off here. The Palestinian Authority, this supposed interim self-governing authority, was supposed to be dissolved in order for the permanent solution, or the final negotiations, to lead to the establishment of Palestine. But events on the ground were pointing to something entirely different. You have the West Bank divided to areas, area A, B, and C. Area C, about 60% of the West Bank, and under total Israeli military control. Area B, of about 21, 22%, under supposedly mutual control, but you're talking about Palestinian police with the Israeli army. So Area B ended up also being almost entirely under Israeli control, and a very small autonomous region, about 18%, which is Area A, falling under Palestinian Authority control. Within that area, Area A, the Palestinian Authority was kind of setting a system to exist as an kind of an administrative authority to manage an autonomous region, as opposed to building a state towards that final status negotiation. There was no state building taking place. Yeah, there was a flag and ministry of this and minister of that, but at the end of the day, there was not an actual process of state building. The final status negotiations were supposed to be held sometimes in 1999 to talk about the fundamental issues that were never discussed anyway. And they were the most important of the issues: the status of Jerusalem, the refugees, the border issues, the illegal settlements, the water, and among others. None of them were discussed prior. And when it came to the final negotiation, or the final status negotiations in 99, the date came and left, and nothing has happened. And it became very clear that this is it. The PA is your ultimate gift, Palestinians, out of all of this endless negotiations. And at the end of the day, there will be no state, there will be no sovereignty, there will be no independence, there will be no territorial expansion of whatever that little area that you have is called. And of course, that kind of set the stage for the period that followed. Arafat began losing credibility, and quickly among Palestinians, under pressure from the United States, Bill Clinton in particular. Arafat started cracking down on Palestinian resistors, started carrying out mass arrests of Palestinians from various movements, but mostly from Hamas. We started hearing about Palestinians being tortured, new human rights reports, Amnesty International reports, talking about the torture of Palestinian prisoners by Israel, but also there's a chapter about the torture of Palestinians by other Palestinians. It was a mess. The Palestinian National Project was in tatters, and the PA was the entity that largely existed to ensure the continuation of the Israeli occupation as opposed to the liberation of the Palestinian people from that very occupation.
And that's very similar to obviously what we had in South Africa as well, where we had people working at the behest of the apartheid regime. They had different skin color, they spoke the language of the people, but they were carrying out the colonial project. Now, naturally, in that tumultuous period in the 90s, post Oslo, when things started to unravel in terms of the truth and what Israel's actual intentions were during Oslo started showing, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority started showing, tension started simmering, because now the Palestinian Authority is arresting its own people. It's doing the work of Israel. And again, we needed another spark. Come fast forward September 2000, and an agent provocateur, Ariel Sharon, decides to storm Masjid al-Aqsa with a whole lot of his henchmen, military and police. And then I have the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa Intifada.
Right. So I think that second Intifada has to be, in a sense, separated from the first Intifada. If for in terms of a proper historical analysis to take place, the first Intifada had no centralized decision involved. It was a spontaneous rebellion by ordinary people. Almost all of them unarmed. Few exceptions appeared later on during the Intifada. So it was about mass mobilization. The PLO and others kind of appeared later on in the game, and they tried to harvest some of the gains of the Intifada and to translate them to some sort of initially a political, prize or political victory of some kind, but that did not work very well, as we discussed. The second Intifada was different because the PLO, the PA were already kind of, they are in Palestine now, and they are in every aspect of Palestinian society. Not just that, but also you are talking about the first post-Oslo generation. These are many of the PA's fighters or police officers, if you will, or security personnel, were members of the Palestine Liberation Army of old. We haven't discussed it in really, but it's worth kind of looking back and understand what the Palestine Liberation Army was. There was still that kind of revolutionary spirit within those newcomers that came from not just Tunisia, but from Egypt, from Yemen, from Jordan, from other parts of the world, kind of returning back to Palestine. And so there was an element of euphoria here. Our children are coming back, our daughters are coming back, our families are being reunited. The degree of hatred that exists right now toward the Palestinian Authority, this corrupt elite that is working hand in hand with Israel to ensure the demise of the Palestinian people, while the Palestinian people are being completely destroyed and exterminated in Gaza, is not the same Palestinian Authority that existed during the Second Intifada. So that's one element. The second element, the popular component, was there, that we have been played, we've been tricked. Oslo wasn't really supposed to lead to anything good for us. So there was a lot of anger in the street, a lot of frustration in the streets, but also a lot of arms in the streets because of the arms that came with the PA that was assigned by Israel to suppress the Palestinians who did not want or rejected the Oslo so-called peace process. So the Second Intifada started soon after the failure of the second Camp David agreement. That was when Yasser Arafat, Ehud Barak, and Bill Clinton tried to kind of push the so-called peace process forward, and they failed. And that failure was not blamed on Israel that refused to honor the various components of Oslo and refused to move forward to give Palestinians a state, but it was blamed squarely on Yasser Arafat. Bill Clinton and others made this ridiculous claim that there was a generous offer that was made by Uhud Barak to Arafat. And Arafat was so arrogant, he said no, because he was too cowardly to embrace peace, the peace of the brave, as they called it, and so on. Later on, we discovered that there was never any generous offer, never an offer that was written down in a paper, in a paper form, or in communicated in a way that would allow Arafat to come back to his people and say, "This is the best I could come up with. Do you agree or not? Can we hold a referendum or not?" No such thing. Israel just simply, from a political point of view, could not move forward, could not deal with the consequences of an actual final agreement with the Palestinians. Clinton was the one that was too cowardly to hold Israel accountable. They blamed it on Arafat. Arafat comes back. He had nothing to offer the Palestinian people. The Intifada erupted. This Intifada, however, had a different aspect to it. Palestinians had arms, although light weapons and pistols and that sort of thing. But the Israelis, now wary of what happened during the First Intifada, they wanted to crush the rebellion before it carries on. So they began bombing Palestinian refugee camps from the air. U.S. supplied Israeli F-35s and 36 began bombing Palestinian refugee camps like Jenin and various areas in Nablus and Ramallah itself, and of course Gaza. Israel saw this as a war declared by Yasser Arafat, and they wanted to send a message to Yasser Arafat: oh, this is your way of trying to put some pressure on us. This is not going to work very well. And they also wanted to send the message to the Israelis: don't worry, this is not going to be another First Intifada. It's going to be different. We are going to crush it, to the point that when Ariel Sharon, who is kind of was the spark for that second Intifada, went to Haram al-Sharif with thousands of soldiers, provoking Palestinian Muslims, and by violating their most sanctified of holy places. When he came to power later on, he promised that he's going to crush the Intifada is in 100 days. Of course, he didn't. The Intifada carried on for 5 years, resulting in one of the largest death tolls among the Palestinians up to that.
This was, and I've got very vivid memories of this, because we started seeing a lot of imagery, we were getting a lot of videos, we were getting a lot of information coming out. But we also have the international media, which follows a certain narrative and which does the bidding of the Zionist colonialists. What narrative do you think the mainstream media followed in this regard? Are there different elements to it, and why do you think they followed that specific narrative?
Of course, I think by definition, the mainstream media has never really changed in its narrative or perceptions of Palestinians, First Intifada or Second Intifada. The First Intifada, because of the element of children throwing rocks and barefoot running in the streets of Nablus and Jabalia, saying free, free Palestine, it allowed a little bit of a margin by mainstream media, but not enough to fundamentally alter the perceptions of Palestine and Israel. Of course not. The Second Intifada was even a war, it was an example where the media really galvanized behind Israel. But the reason that I say that the mainstream media has, by definition, always followed the same script is because mainstream media is not an independently thinking intellectual or entity making independent choices and decisions based on the orders of some editor somewhere, saying, let's take this position on this issue and this other position on this other issue, as if there's an issue of morality involved or rational thinking. Obviously not. This has never been the case. Mainstream media is a corporate project. These powerful corporations are often linked to political parties, to the arm industry, to big companies and so forth. And their interests always lie with the Zionists, always lie with American imperialism, always lie with Western corporations. It's not going to lie with the Palestinians because we have nothing to offer them, right? In that particular incident in history, however, um, the narrative was stacked against the Palestinians before the Intifada even started, because of, as I said, the whole myth about the generous offer that Ehud Barak was ready to give Palestinians everything they wanted, but for whatever reason, Yasser Arafat said no, and we don't really know why. Therefore, it's the Palestinians who should be blamed because, and this constant quoting of Henry Kissinger's statements about Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So all this, this context comes back blaming the Palestinians, and therefore, when the Intifada started, that context was already there. So everything merged into it. The Intifada started because Yasser Arafat has failed to accept the generous offer provided to him by Israel, and therefore it is the Palestinians who are responsible for anything that was to happen during that Intifada. No matter the degree of violence, there can be no other context. So there was the decontextualization of the violence, and to completely failing to explain the Palestinian action as a response to decades of Israeli occupation, dispossession, the failure of the so-called peace process to deliver, and so forth and so on. Another element is the overemphasis of the Israeli casualties, because that's when Palestinians began using, the martyrdom attacks or the suicide bombings, whatever you want to call them. So now we know so much about Israeli society because the victims are popular now, and the families of the victims are on CNN and BBC and all Western media. You know nothing about the Palestinian victims. They're just numbers, they're statistics. Nothing about their children, their families, and the deep loss affecting Palestinian society. We know now so much about the Israelis who are being victimized supposedly by the Palestinians, while the brutality of the Israeli occupation is being downplayed constantly. I did a book about it. My first book was Searching Jenin, about the massacre of Jenin, and I can't even tell you the kind of difficulty I had to deal with being constantly attacked, sometimes blocked from entering into lecture halls in the in various American campuses, because I was supposedly uh, kind of misinterpreting what happened in the massacre of Jenin. It was the Israelis who were under attack by those Jenin terrorists. There was no massacre. It's a Palestinian lie. Until now, they talk about, remember when Palestinians lied about the Jenin massacre and so forth and so on. So that's really when we saw the ugliest face of mainstream media, in my opinion, kind of just coming to Israel's rescue from the very beginning, again, because they did not want to have a repeat of what happened during the First Intifada, in which there was some margins and some ways in which the Palestinian narrative did manage to reach a large number of people outside Palestine.
And I suppose one of the major elements that has literally shifted world opinion, by people on the streets, I mean, not so much governments, that has turned the opinion of people and educated people, in this Nakba that we're seeing in Gaza right now, was the change of access to media, because we had youth on the streets in Gaza picking up their phones and becoming citizen reporters and sharing with the world in real time what is actually happening. So you had this, a lot of people, they had serious issues in terms of understanding, because they were fed one narrative all their lives, and then all of a sudden now they're seeing images. So it's causing this, this confusion in their minds. And a lot of the public in a lot of countries around the world, in the US, in the UK, in a lot of so-called allied countries of Israel, people have been taking to the streets and shifted the entire understanding and the narrative, which is why you're seeing pushback now happen on the streets in the US, in terms of what's happening recently with ICE detentions and picking up of students, what's happening in the UK, what's happening in Germany with police brutality against protesters. All of this has changed. So two questions, or 2 points here rather. Firstly, during the first Nakba, obviously it wasn't publicized. We didn't have the access to media that we have. More people have been displaced in Gaza in the last year and a half than we had during the first Nakba. So, firstly, if you can just look at how we got here, and where do you think we go from here? And then, secondly, what has the impact been on Western streets, on the Western populace, by what they're seeing in through social media channels and through social media outlets, despite the strong pushback, or despite the Zionist media trying to buy into social media. So we know this, we've experienced this on Instagram. You know, your posts get taken down when you share anything about Palestine, your posts get taken down. Meta has an active policy. They've got ex-Unit 8200 members working within Meta, heading up their Palestinian division, if you could call it that. Things look unstable in the eyes of the West going forward. How do you view this? How did we get here, and how and in terms of the narrative, how do we move forward from here?
Right. So there are lots of points here, and see if we've been talking for about an hour and 40 minutes. So we'll see if my brain has the ability to unpack some of these points. First, the term Nakba itself. I'm not keen on the term Nakba because, as I said, that these terminologies that we create within Palestinian society, Nakba, Naksa, Intifada, uprising, not just any uprising. In Arabic language, Intifada means to shake off, a people shaking off occupation, years of neglect and marginalization. It has a psychological impact. You dub this Nakba, it's over. The outcome of the war, no matter what happens now in Gaza, it's over. It's a Nakba and will always be remembered with a sense of defeat. And I refuse that. I think it all depends on what will happen in this war. We are trying to prevent it from being a Nakba or Nakba 2. Yeah, of course, there is the aspect of the dispossession of the Palestinians, people carrying their belongings and being pushed from Beit Hanun to Gaza to Nusayrat to Khan Yunis and Rafah and back and forth and back and forth. There's so many aspects of that Nakba. And there's an aspect of every war and every genocide and every ethnic cleansing. But to become a Nakba, it means that the outcome has already been predetermined, and it hasn't. There is an element of revival here. There is a revival of the Palestinian national movement. There's the revival of the Palestinian people as a political agent. There is a revival of regional and Muslim and international solidarity around Palestine. There is a revival of so many aspects of what has been kind of a done deal as far as Israel is concerned. Israel was looking for a final solution. The normalization between Israel and the Arabs was supposed to be this final solution. This idea, I don't know, was it a credit to Mohammed ibn Salman or Jared Kushner? There's some confusion about it, but Palestinians can either put up or shut up, right? So what is happening right now on the side of the Palestinians, I cannot control what my enemy does to me. My enemy can carry a genocide. That's my enemy's choice. And it's everybody's responsibility is to hold those who carry genocide accountable to morality, to legality, to international law. But my side of this is that I am fighting a liberation. My side in this is that I'm resisting, and the outcome can only be determined at the very end. And we don't know what is going to happen. I strongly believe that Israel will not be able to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians out of Gaza. That Israel will not be able to alter the politics of Gaza, and that Israel will not be able to deprive the Palestinians from their ability to reassert themselves as absolutely fundamental to any lasting stability or a just peace in the region, normalization or no normalization, right? Israel has always been good at dealing with problems and then kind of finding a way to rebrand the problem into something else. After the Nakba, for example, Ben Gurion, sometimes in the early 1950s, feeling the pressure of many people asking the questions about why Palestinian refugees are refugees. So he asked a group of Israeli academics to come up with a good kind of official discourse of what can Israel say about the Palestinian refugees to defend itself from any moral and legal responsibility. And they came up with a document, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a Zionist newspaper, but at the end of the day, they can offer sometimes an alternative way to that of right-wing mainstream media in Israel. Actually managed to find that document in the archive. It has a very complicated, strange name with many letters and numbers, but essentially it was that single document that was officially offered as, we did not push the Palestinians out, the Arabs told them to flee, and so forth. And that becomes the mainstream understanding of what actually happened in the Nakba. Israel has done this many, many times. As we discussed, the Aqsa, it was a preemptive strike because Nasser was going to attack us. The Second Intifada, Arafat was trying to play politics. Every single time there was always a narrative. We did this because they have done that. This time around, the Israeli narrative faltered, and I would say completely faltered, where they came up and they said, well, this genocide is really not because we want to kill anybody, but it's an act of self-defense because of what Palestinians happened in October 7. And by the way, history started on October 7, 2023. Everything prior to that was good and dandy. We left them alone. We already left Gaza. It's an independent territory. It's not our business to take care of the Palestinians and so forth. We are not an occupying power. And they just, for no reason, came and attacked us and took hostages. That narrative, I would say, lasted for about 2 weeks. That's it. And after that, you started seeing a shift because of the power of the Palestinian narrative and because of the young kids of Gaza. This is not the work of Ramzy Baroud or anybody else. It's the children of Gaza, it's the people of Gaza who managed to extract the truth during the times of genocide and to tell the rest of the world, before you make up your mind about this, what is happening right now, we would like you to see this footage. We would like you to hear these voices. We would like you to look at these numbers. We would like you to look at our faces and listen to our words and internalize that and tell us if Israel had the right to do what it's doing in Gaza. And this is why Israel began doing two things. Number one, they began killing Palestinian journalists in large numbers. I think the last number I checked was about 212, maybe more, of journalists who have been targeted and assassinated by Israel, hundreds wounded, many arrested and detained until today. We don't know where they are, and so forth. So being a journalist is as dangerous as being a fighter in Gaza at this moment, because Israel knows very well that its enemy is the truth. Its enemy is not just a Qassam fighter with a gun, but the truth on what is happening in Gaza. And this happened not because of mainstream media, despite of mainstream media. It didn't happen because of anyone, but despite of everyone. And I think this is a really powerful message from the Palestinians in Gaza to the rest of the world. Tell your own story. Don't wait for someone else to reinterpret your story and tell it on your behalf. Don't sit on the sideline and listen to them trying to capture you in words and footage and political and academic discourses. Create your own discourse yourself, even if it's the last thing you do. And in the case of Palestinians, many of these journalists actually had last words that they communicated as they were dying. Now, social media, mainstream media, any kind of media, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the message originated from the Palestinians, and it is up to us in the rest of the world to take that message and to make it visible to as many people as possible. Social media has been censoring Palestinians for a very long time. Prior to that, we know that there was an agreement between that kid, Mark Zuckerberg, with Israel, I think Shimon Peres, I can't remember it, but it was a good number of years ago, on basically allowing the Israelis to be involved in the censoring of Palestinians on Facebook. That censorship, however, became so extreme during the war, because it was very clear there was an organization, I think it's an Israeli organization called Humans, with a Z, Humans, that very early on came up with this shocking statistics for Israel that says something like 93%, don't quote me on this, something around that number, of all social media taglines are sympathetic to the Palestinians, and only 7 are sympathetic to Israel. That was, and this happened so very early on, before all of these things happened, before these numbers swelled to become what they are right now, before the genocide became recognized as genocide, and before Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant were wanted criminals by the International Criminal Court, and before South Africa went to the ICJ saying that you need to hold Israel accountable for genocide and so forth and so forth. The world was already getting the message that there's something horrific going on in Palestine. Will Israel be able, after all of this, to use its trickery and its access American public through sitcoms and music and Hollywood and all of this to sell them the idea now that Israel is an oasis of democracy and civilizations, and Arabs and Palestinians are barbarians, Bedouins, nomads who are trying to carry out another Holocaust against Israel? I don't think so. I think the age of the Israeli propaganda has been shattered, and I think it's going to be shattered for a very long time. And it's going to be our responsibility after the war to ensure that it never resurfaces, and the priorities and the voice of the Palestinian people is constantly centered in everything that we do. Not just the Palestinian people's voice, the truly representative Palestinian voice, the Palestinian who believes in the resistance and the rights of people to resist, believes in the right of return, believes in all of these things. This is the voice of the Palestinian that must be centered from now on, from now until Palestine is truly and finally an independent and free entity.
Dr. Ramzy Baroud, it's been an absolute pleasure. We were meant to speak for just about an hour. The topic is one you can speak on at length. We hope, inshallah, that we have an opportunity to speak with you again. We really, really appreciate your time on behalf of the team at Social Intifada and the Unapologetic Muslim. And for all our viewers, this is going to be immensely beneficial. We thank you sincerely for your time. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much, brother, and keep up the good work. Always happy to talk to you and engage with you. But just one very final thing must be said: that what South African society first and government second have done is absolutely incredible. You are creating a model that would actually make a strong argument that we can actually become a moral society with moral politics. But this only happened because of the years and years of organizations and grassroots efforts that have been taking place in South Africa for years prior to the genocide in Gaza. So thank you very much for that, and keep up the good work.
Jazakumullah khair.